Hey there, FLOSSTUBE. This is Cathy, the hands-on designer, and I want to welcome you to the Polar Plunge finishing tutorial. I'm so excited about this series. It was fun to design these little polar animals. It started with an idea. Create a way that we could give back. We've done that with other designs, and we're always looking for something new. The idea was based on a polar plunge, one of the largest fundraisers that Special Olympics does across the country. You know, raise money by jumping into freezing cold water. Well, the jumping into freezing cold water isn't exactly for me, but if the series was designed to end with a really special piece that was only available on my website as a PDF, and we would donate all of the sales of each chart, wouldn't that be a really cool thing? No pun intended. Watch our FLOSSTUBE number 78 to learn more about the details of how this series came to be and the story behind that special sixth and final donation piece. Let's get started. You'll need to grab a few items to finish your ornaments. Some basics: scissors, rotary cutter, batting, double-sided tape. More specifically, some matboard, maybe some sponge brushes, lacing thread, a nail file, some paint. I'll give the number later. Spray adhesive, an exacto blade, some Rickrack from Lady Creates. The color I used is snow, appropriately enough, and a polar pack of finishing boards designed by Chantal of 141 Design Company, as pictured here. Each pack contains 6 finishing boards and 1 template. I stitched my ornaments on 32 count Polar Plunge fabrics by Stephanie, a color she designed just for this series. This will also work for 16 count, and I would say that it would work for, say, a 14 or a 28 count as well. You'll just need to adjust the template size, and you'll have a little less of the backing board showing, but it should work. Order all of your supplies from your local and online shop, and let's get going. We are going to jump around a little bit in this tutorial. I'm actually I took the pictures as I went through the steps, and this is how I'm going to present it to you. So I kind of suggest that maybe you watch through first, or you can totally start and stop the tutorial if you're doing everything in one step. So I started by painting the boards. This was the paint that I chose. It's number 2430 Uniform Blue. I got mine at my local Hobby Lobby, or you could probably order it online. I just felt like this was a good color. It was a deep blue, had a little bit of a teal overtone to it, which I thought really complemented the piece. One bottle would be fine. You can see I'm kind of a messy painter. I really get into my craft. It washes off easily. I don't mind getting a little messy. So I've got real top quality accessories here. I grabbed some paper plates from the kitchen, and I shake the bottle of paint and I squirt a little onto the paper plate, and I use my sponge brush, and I just carefully paint thin layers onto the boards. I always make sure that I paint in one direction, or if you're going to paint around, always finish with one direction so you get a nice finish to it. I did not worry about painting the sides. These boards are laser cut, so you'll notice that the sides are very dark brown because that's where the laser is basically burning the shape. Chantal tells me it doesn't always take the paint as well, so I didn't really worry about that since we had a dark color. I did get a little paint on my edges in a few spots, and later you'll see I'm going to take a sanding block to it anyway, and quite frankly, it didn't really show up that much, and I was able to sand a little bit off. I just really didn't worry about the edges. So be careful, don't get globs of paint on the edge, but also don't worry about them either. So I painted all 6 of my boards. Actually, I did a few extra, you'll see later in the tutorial, as I was kind of experimenting. So while those are drying, I grabbed my finishing template. Yes, you only get one finishing template because we're not actually going to finish on the template. We're using it as a template. So I grabbed some basic matboard and I traced my pieces, my different pieces that I would need onto the matboard. Here I was able to get 4 out of it. I had several 8.5 by 11 sheets of of matboard. So trace those, and then I did use an exacto blade, and I cut those into 4 different sections. As you can see here, I've got one of the pieces, and when I'm cutting, especially shaped matboard pieces, I like to start with all the straight edges, if there are any. In this case, we've got the bottom and we've got the 2 sides have some straight edges. So I used my quilting ruler, and I used my exacto blade, and I lined that up, and I got a nice smooth finish. I would really prefer you to use a ruler and a blade for the straight sections. I find you just get the nicest, straightest lines that way. For the top curved section, obviously it's going to be easier to use a scissors here. Now you are cutting through matboard, so it can be hard on the hands at times. So if that is an issue for you, make sure that you've got somebody close by that can help you with that. Take your time, make the cuts I guess I can't emphasize enough, take your time so you get a nice smooth look. Once I have my matboard pieces all cut, I put a piece of double-sided acid-free tape on one side of each. I layered 2 small pieces of thin Warm and Natural batting, one on top of the other, peeled the paper backing off the double-sided tape, and then laid the tape onto the 2 pieces of batting. You don't need to put a piece of double-sided tape between the layers of batting. They will kind of adhere to each other just fine. And really, you don't even have to do the double-sided tape if you don't have any on hand. That's all right. I do this just as a little helping hand because we're going to be centering our stitching and moving it around a little bit as we lace. And this way, the batting doesn't shift on you as well. It's just kind of a little helping hand. So I took my little Wally the Walrus here and I centered him, held it up to the light, kind of figured out where I liked him the best. Then I turned the whole thing over, laid it Wally side down onto my cutting mat, and I grabbed my ruler again and my rotary cutter, and I trimmed the linen all the way around 1 inch from the mat board. Now, not 1 inch from the stitched image, 1 inch from the mat board. If you trim 1 inch from the stitched image, you're going to have much less linen and it'll be a little more difficult for you to lace. Here's what mine looked like when I got done trimming away the linen from the mat board. No, the top edge is probably not a perfect arc of the domed part of this. That's okay. I would rather you have a little bit more and take your time with this. So as we lace, we have plenty. I always say it's much harder to weave it all back together and a whole lot easier to just trim more if we need to. Now you notice here I've turned everything on its side with the flat bottom edge to my right. I'm a righty. Lefties probably want to go in the opposite direction. When I lace a piece that has a curve to it or a shape to it, I like to start with my straight edge to my straight edge. You can also take a peek at my static tutorial on my website for the 12 days of Christmas, 12 days of finishing too, probably, 12 days of Christmas, where I did a step-by-step tutorial of how to lace a shaped, or in this case, a domed piece. I'm going to follow the same directions, but it might give you another fresh perspective on it as well. So I'm going to lace the top side down to the bottom side, the 2 flat edges first. I grabbed a needle. I like to use a sharp needle when I lace. This is just an embroidery needle. It's got a decent sized head so I can lace the lacing thread through, and I create a knot at the other end. I just find I get a little better control with a sharp tip needle as opposed to a tapestry needle, although you could certainly use a tapestry needle if you like. I did, as I said, knot the other end of the lacing thread. In this case, I use an upholstery thread. You can find it in any of your large craft stores or fabric stores. It will say upholstery. It's a nylon thread. Here I cut a very long length. I usually prefer, especially if I'm lacing a small ornament like this, I prefer to have one thread lace the entire thing rather than start and stop. Nothing wrong if you have to. I just have found over the years I prefer to do it this way. So you'll have a lot to pull through in the beginning, but that's okay. You'll be shortening that up pretty quick as you lace forward. So you can see here, I took one stitch through the linen, about halfway between the folded edge and the raw edge, and went in and out of the linen, following parallel to the edge of the linen, kind of taking what I call a scooping stitch. And I'll be referring to this scooping stitch more. This is how I do all of my lacing. So once you pull the needle all the way through to the end, I always, where I start, take a second little scoop stitch just a few threads away from where I took that first scoop stitch. I do this because I want to make sure that that first scoop stitch is secure. I like to pull pretty tight when I lace, so I don't want to pull my knot through the linen and undo everything that I've done. Now I'm ready to start lacing back and forth from top side to bottom side. You can see I've done another scooping stitch through the bottom side. My stitch is probably about close to a half an inch. And I've done it about halfway between, again, the raw side and the folded side, and fairly close to the bottom edge of the mat board, because I really want to start lacing at that bottom spot. You'll see later why that's important. And I'm going to pull the needle all the way through, and I'm going to pull tight. Here you can see what my lacing pattern looks like as I work my way up the one flat edge to the opposite flat edge. Now, if you'll see where my finger is pointing, I'm pointing for a couple of reasons. Because when we're dealing with a shaped mat board, you're going to lace, obviously a little different than if we do just like a rectangle or a square. I want to stop that lacing back and forth, flat edge to flat edge, right where the curve of the mat board begins. So if you look forward to where my next stitch would be on the top side, you'll see the board's actually starting to curve a little bit. So I'm stopping down at where my finger is pointing, and I'm actually taking what I call a safety knot. With each lacing stitch that I take, I'm holding on to the thread to make sure that everything I've laced prior to that stays nice and tight. You can always go back and tighten those stitches up a little bit, but I have found, and I guess I'm used to doing that over the years, I'm really holding on to all those stitches to keep my lacing as tight as possible as I go. I also add a little safety knot right here. I run the needle back through the linen, pull it through till there's a little loop of the thread, run my needle through the thread, and then cinch it down tight. Now I can move forward with my next steps of lacing and not have to worry about the previous lacing stitches that I took. They're all secure. So I'm going to head off in the opposite direction now, and I'm going to start by taking some basting stitches. Kind of look like the scoop stitches that we've been taking earlier, and you would be correct. Also, this might look like, if you've ever watched any of my other tutorials on circular finishes, this looks like how I do the gathering stitches on the circle, and you would also be correct. I'm going to do these gathering stitches all across the dome of the ornament. I do want to stop here. Apparently I did not take a picture of this, but I want to make note. Before we start these gathering stitches, please turn your ornament over and make sure that your image is still centered. Scoot it around as you need to make sure to get it back on track and be centered. Because once we start these stitches, your stitching is pretty much locked into place. Let's get back to making those basting stitches all across the top. And that's what it should look like. Now you'll see my index finger again is holding down that thread. That's what I mean when I say that as I lace, I'm holding the thread down in place to make sure that my previous stitches are held nice and tight. This would also be a good spot to create another little safety knot that I explained earlier in that earlier step. You'll see as I move forward, I actually apparently chose not to put a safety knot in, but this is small enough that we'll be able to gather these stitches back up nice and tight. Here you can see what I mean by that, as my basting threads stitches across the top have kind of come loose. That's okay. In my next couple steps, I'll be able to pull tightly enough to gather those back up again. For now, I want to turn the bottom edge of the linen over. Now you'll notice as I turned it, the linen sort of angled in. If those first few lacing stitches that I did back a few previous steps ago are tight enough, this will happen naturally. That linen will get pulled in, and that's the look we want to go for. Basically, we don't want the linen that's folded up to peek out the side edge of the ornament at all. It's almost as if you're wrapping a package. Think of it that way. So you'll notice I'm taking a little tacking stitch between the linen that's previously been laced and then running the needle through the fold of the linen pretty close to that corner. That's how I find I get really pretty corners. I just love a good crisp corner on an ornament. I know it's a little thing, but I just really like the way it looks. And I get that with that first tacking stitch. Here's a close-up again of what that tacking stitch is going to look like. Now I've got enough linen in the fold that I'm going to take 2 more tacking stitches. So we'll do 3 in all. Again, running the needle through the linen on the bottom, through then the crease in the linen that's been folded over the top. Once I finish those tacking stitches, I am now going to start lacing back and forth, just as I did in the previous steps, from the top that I folded in and the gathered bottom, I guess, which will eventually be the top, back and forth. And here you can see what that looks like as I go. The basting stitches help ease the linen over. And then the lacing stitches will help tighten that up to make sure there's no lumps and bumps and creases. So this is what it looks like once I've reached the other side. I'm going to end in the opposite corner doing those same 3 tacking stitches. You can see I started first down in the corner, and then I took 2 more. I then knotted through the folded edge of the linen several times because this is where I'm actually going to end everything. So you have 2 choices here. If you don't have a long enough thread and you need to end, I would suggest you run the needle through the linen away from the knot. Just a little bit. I don't like you to cut too close to your knot. There's a lot of pressure on that knot, and if we cut too close to it and it becomes loose, then you lose all of your previous lacing stitches, and we don't want that to happen. Now in this case, I apparently started with a really long lacing thread, so I ran my needle all the way down to that lower corner because this is where we're going to start attaching the rickrack. Now I invite you to watch FLOSSTUBE number 66. It's a tutorial, it's a classroom type tutorial on how I finished my season 2 series, The Year of Celebrations Continues. I showed how I attached the rickrack on all 4 sides of a square. I really have never liked how to turn rickrack on a corner. Rickrack is very bendable and it's really fun to use on a curve. Corners, not so much. So what I do is I actually cut for a square 4 different pieces. Now in this, we're not going to do 4 different pieces. We're actually going to do 2. So 1 small one across the straight bottom edge, then 1 slightly longer one for our straight side, around the curved domed top, and then down the opposite side. But let's start with just that little piece on the bottom edge. Now, as I said in the previous step, I had enough lacing thread left over, so I ran the needle under the linen and brought it out at that corner, and that's where I'm going to start tacking my rickrack to the back side of my little ornaments. So you can see here, I ran my needle. This is how you would start it, actually, if you had to start up a new thread. You would run the needle through the linen, there'd be a knot on the end of it, and then through the Rickrack, and just grab it and probably make that stitch twice just to really secure it in place. Now, in the video, I showed you how to use double-sided tape to attach the Rickrack. You could use the double-sided tape for this straight edge. The double-sided tape isn't really going to work in the curve as well. That's why I thought I would show you how to tack it in place. Once I've got my end secure, you can see that I'm going through the linen with the needle and coming out in the middle of that first little, like the little high-rise portion. We're not going to take a lot of stitches through these. In fact, I'm probably going to hit every bump or high-rise portion, so it goes pretty quickly. The first couple stitches can be a little fiddly because your Rickrack's still kind of moving around, but once you get a few stitches in, it settles down into place. I'm going to warn you, it's not necessarily a pretty look on the back. That's okay. It's on the back, and you're not going to see it later. But I just thought this was maybe a different technique than I've used before in attaching Rickrack, so I thought I'd share it with you. This is what your Rickrack will look like from the front, as you just have the little bumps or edges showing beyond the edge of that nice crisp corner. I just really love the way that looks. You would then stitch the straight bottom side all the way to the other end, and then work onto the longer piece, as I mentioned. That'll go up the straight side, curve around the top, and then go all the way down the following side. Unfortunately, I did not take as many pictures through this section as I thought I did, but you get the idea of how I tacked it into place. This would be a good spot for maybe using those little clips that we like to use just to hold the Rickrack in place. Rickrack is very pliable, as I said before, and it really moves nicely with the curves of an ornament like this. That's why I really like using it. So once you tack the flat bottom all the way across to the other side, then you'll want to start the long section of Rickrack in the same way. Now, I'm going to suggest that you're probably going to end up tacking the beginning of the Rickrack, of the long piece of Rickrack, to the end of the first part of the Rickrack. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but I think you get the idea. This is what your corners look like, and as I mentioned before, I used to always struggle with how to turn the corner with Rickrack. And one time I just sat down and I really thought about it, and I thought, well, does there need to be Rickrack right at the corner? Nope, no, there doesn't. And that's when I started cutting the individual pieces, and I was really just much more happy with the look of it on the front side. All right, so we're going to go back to our boards. They've all been dried, and I sanded them down a little bit, and I took a sanding block to the very edges. You can kind of see they look like they're kind of white on the edges. That's just actually the natural board color. And I do that just to kind of make sure like there's no like paint blobs on the edge, and I was able to knock down a couple blobs that I had gotten on the very edge. But as I said before, I really didn't sweat any paint. If I got a little bit on the side, you're really not going to see it with that dark brown edge. Didn't worry about it. I did go over my paint. You get a kind of a flat finish with this acrylic paint. I realize it's acrylic and it shouldn't be flat, but I like to seal mine a little bit. So I use a clear coat sealer. I just went over it, just gave it a light one coat. It comes in a spray paint can. Did that and let it dry, and it just gives a low sheen. I just really like the way it finishes. Here's what mine looks like. Here you can really see how I sanded that edge. I am one of those, I like to, when I paint furniture and I kind of like to vintage things up, I tend to really attack the edges. It just kind of gives it that worn look, and that's something that appeals to me. It's not something you have to do. Here's what the front of our board looks like. That's what we're getting ready to cover. I found this scrapbook paper at my local Hobby Lobby. It's what we have here in town. We don't have any specialty scrapbook stores. So let me tell you, I was really thrilled that I was able to find this paper. The blue was perfect. The scatter print snowflakes were perfect. I honestly was a little afraid it would be too busy, but then you have to remember you're only really seeing a ½ inch around the entire thing. Once I got going through the process, I just thought it couldn't have been more perfect, and I was just happy that it was readily available. These are the numbers. This is what it's called, Navy Blue Snowflakes. It is navy blue, but I'll tell you, it does still also have kind of a little tealy sheen to it, and it was like it was meant to be. The colors just really mixed perfectly with my ornaments. I determined how many ornament fronts I could get out of a sheet. I believe this was 8.5 by 11, whatever maybe 9 by 12, whatever their standard size is. And I could get 2 out of each size. So I keep this on hand. Actually, I use it in a lot of different crafts and finishes that I do. If you don't have this, you'll want to pick something up like this. It's just a little spray adhesive. I took each of my ornaments, and I'm doing this in the garage because, well, it was February when I did this, so I couldn't do it outside, and just know that I'm doing this well away from cars. I often keep these boxes. I keep a stash of them when I do projects like this, so I can kind of use them as a little paint studio, because I want to make sure I don't cover anything that I shouldn't with either Easy Tack or clear coat or spray paint. Once I sprayed them with the spray adhesive, and I got a pretty good coverage because I wanted to make sure it was full coat, I put those onto my pieces of scrapbook paper. I took mine inside and laid them nice and flat to dry. Now you're probably thinking, boy, she did a lot more than we've got ornaments for. I was working through this process, and I wanted to make sure I had a few in case I had a few oopsies. I'm very happy to say that I didn't have any oopsies. This was kind of a new technique for me to use, and I was pleasantly surprised how it turned out. When the spray tack was all dry, I cut the paper in half just so I would be dealing with one ornament at a time. I grabbed my exacto blade, made sure I started with a fresh, clean blade because I did not want the paper to rip in any way, shape, or form. I lined the blade up next to the finishing board, and I used that as a guide, and I just gently pulled along the edge of the finishing board and made a clean cut through the paper. I did my flat sides first just to make sure I kind of had the hang of it before I attempted all the curves. And I think the curves worked out pretty well too. Here's what it looks like when it's all covered. You can see I haven't poked through those holes yet. And here's what the front side's going to look like. Remember I said a nail file or an emery board? Well, this is actually a trick that I've used before for other parts of finishing. Is I always have one of those on hand in case I need to take a little burr off of a mat board or foam core or something like that. And I thought, well, this could come in handy to file down the edge of the paper. It gives me that same kind of white rim that I did on the back with the sanding block. I wasn't comfortable using a sanding block on this because I was afraid maybe it would rip the paper or be too hard for the paper. So I thought the emery board was actually just the perfect fit. Plus, it allowed me to get into those interior corners where the top curve meets the next curve. So there's what it looks like when I am done doing my magic with the emery board. I just really liked the way it made a nice, clean, crisp look along the edge. So now we have to poke those holes that Chantal did in the top. And I just that was her idea. I'm giving full credit to her. I just love it. And you'll see we use them when we go to put a ribbon and a hanger on this. It was just great. Now I am going to suggest that you poke your holes from the front to the back. I'm using just a double pointed knitting needle here that I keep on hand. I don't knit as much as I used to. I probably get more use out of my knitting needles for finishing tools than I do anything else now. So you can see I poked through all 3 holes, and that's what it should look like. Again, I went from the front to the back. It was, you had to kind of fiddle around to find the hole to go through. I suggest that because if I poked from the back to the front, I was more concerned that the paper might rip, and I didn't want that on the front. I had a little bit of extra paper on the back. You could take the emery board to it. You could take the sanding block to it. Honestly, you're putting ribbon through it. You are not going to be able to see that. So now I am ready to attach my little polar bear to the completed backing board Polar Plunge finishing board. Grab my double-sided tape, and I covered the back of my polar bear with this double-sided acid-free tape. I like this tape because, well, I pretty much use it in almost every finish that I do for one thing or another. And this, you can cut the length you need. I was able to cover the back completely. You could see I notched the corners where the dome started, and it really provided enough adhesive to attach to the backing board without a problem. Oh, a fun little quick break here. One day, the day when I was finishing all these, Bill was out running some errands, and he knew I was really working hard getting all these done. And he stopped into the local bakery, and they had these cute little cookie sets, and he just had to bring me one home, which they were delicious. So here's a fun little polar bear. And then this was what was in the whole set of them: the polar bear, the penguin, and the snowflake. And the colors were perfect. It was just really fun. I couldn't bring myself yet to eat a polar bear or a penguin, so I started with the cookie, and they were delicious. All right, back to it. Let's finish up our ornament. So I used my needle nose pliers, went through the top hole, and I grabbed my ribbon for the hanger. I cut it probably about 8 to 9 inches, and I grabbed in the middle, pulled it all the way through, and then I created an overhand knot to create my hanger. Now you'll want a knot at the top of it. I like about a 3-inch drop. So what I do is I line, you can see where I lined the ribbon up on my matboard. I counted up about, or no, on my cutting mat, excuse me, and I figured out about where 3 inches is, and that's where I tied my knot. I don't know why. Somebody told me a long time ago when I was finishing ornaments, I ran my finishing business full time, people like a 3-inch drop. I don't know why that is, but that is just what I've always done consistently for my ornaments. So I like to just have a little mixed media. So I did a different ribbon for the bow. Plus I'm a gingham girl. I cut it on point. This ribbon is about a 5/8 inch ribbon. I would say the hanger ribbon is more of a 3/8, 1/4 inch to a 3/8. I didn't mind that the ribbon got a little bunched up in the holes for the bow. It just kind of added to the overall fullness of it. I trimmed it on an angle to help with both the fraying plus also leading it through the hole. Went through the front side of the one hole and came out the back side of the next hole. And I created my bow, trimmed it up. And just because I felt like it wasn't done, it just needed a little bit more to it, I had these fancy, cute little red jingle bells, and I needled up a sharp needle with some red floss because it'll show on the outside, so the red would kind of disappear. And I just tacked a little jingle bell in place. And you are now done with all of your ornaments. I thank you so much for taking the plunge with us in this really fun series, and I can't wait to show you the remaining ornaments, and we really look forward to the opportunity to use this as a philanthropic project to help some athletes that are very deserving. Thank you so much.